Some folks spend their whole lives believing they own a thing, only to find out one quiet evening that it was never theirs to begin with. Caleb Turner had land stretching a mile past the cottonwood line and another 2 beyond the creek where the water ran low in August, and he carried that knowledge the way a man carries a well-worn rifle, steady, certain, without needing to check it twice. The Turner Ranch sat wide under a pale Texas sky, boards sun-bleached, fences leaning just enough to show age but not weakness, and the house at its center held a kind of silence that settled deep into the wood, the kind that didn't come from peace, but from too many evenings spent with only the wind pressing against the windows. He'd built most of it himself after his father passed, added the back room, fixed the roof twice over, stacked firewood higher than any man living alone had reason to need, and still, come sundown, there was always more space than there was sound. That morning had started like any other, coffee boiled strong enough to bite, poured into a tin cup and left half finished on the table while he checked the south fence line, boots pressing into dust that hadn't seen rain in near 3 weeks. By the time he rode back, the sun was sitting high and mean, and there was a wagon in his yard that hadn't been there before. It stood crooked near the hitching post, one wheel sunk deeper into the dirt, like it had made the decision to stay before anyone else had. Caleb slowed his horse, eyes narrowing just enough to take in the details. The driver nowhere in sight, the mule tied loose, and a single trunk set down near the porch, leather worn soft at the edges. Then he saw her. She stood by the door like she'd been waiting a long time, though there was no dust on her hem to suggest the road had treated her kindly. Plain dress, faded blue, sleeves rolled just enough to show hands that didn't belong to someone delicate. Not young, not old. Somewhere in between where life had already asked its share and she'd answered without complaint. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched him come in like she was measuring something. Caleb swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, and tied off the reins without taking his eyes off her. "You lost?" he asked, voice rough from the heat and the quiet he'd grown used to. She shook her head once, small and certain. "No, sir." Her voice was steady, carried something from back east, maybe Ohio or Pennsylvania, the kind that didn't rush its words. "Then you're in the wrong place," he said, brushing dust from his hands. "This ain't a boarding house." She glanced past him, toward the land stretching out behind the barn, then back to his face. "No," she said, almost like she agreed. "It isn't." That was when he noticed the letter in her hand, folded careful along the creases, like it had been opened and closed more times than paper was meant to bear. She held it out, not stepping closer, just enough that he could take it if he chose. Caleb didn't move right away. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dry grass and something else. Soap, maybe, or clean fabric that hadn't belonged to this place in a long while. Finally, he reached for the paper, fingers brushing hers for the briefest second, long enough to feel the calluses there. Long enough to know she wasn't what the boys in town would have called a joke. But that's exactly what she was supposed to be. He unfolded the letter, recognized the handwriting before he read a single word. Eli Harwick's, sloppy and confident in a way that said the man thought too highly of himself. Caleb's jaw tightened just a fraction as the meaning settled in. A bride. Sent without asking. Sent, most likely, with a laugh shared over whiskey in a room he hadn't stepped foot in for near a year. He looked up at her again, slower this time, taking in the way she stood without shifting her weight, the way she didn't fill the silence with excuses or apologies. "You came a long way for a mistake," he said. She didn't flinch. "I came because the letter said there was work," she replied, "and a place to stay." The words sat between them, simple as bread on a table. Caleb glanced at the house behind her, at the door that hadn't been opened for anyone but him in longer than he cared to count. Then back at the woman standing like she had no intention of leaving, just because she'd been sent for the wrong reason. Something in his chest shifted, small enough he could have ignored it if he tried. Instead, he stepped past her, pushed the door open, and let it swing wide. "Supper's at sundown," he said, not looking back. "If you're still here." Behind him, there was a pause, the kind that stretched just long enough to mean something, and then the sound of her boots on the porch boards, steady and unhurried, like she'd already decided she was staying. The house held on to the heat long after the sun began its slow drop toward the horizon, the kind of lingering warmth that clung to the walls and made the air feel thicker than it ought to be, and Caleb noticed it the moment he stepped back inside, though it took him a second longer to understand why. The window by the table had been opened just enough to let a narrow ribbon of evening breeze slip through, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and distant water, and on the stove, something simmered low and steady, the lid shifting soft with each rise of steam. He stopped just inside the doorway, hat still in his hand, eyes moving across the room in small, careful increments like a man checking his own place for signs it might have changed without asking him first. The table had been cleared, not just wiped, but set. 2 plates, blue enamel with worn edges, sat opposite each other, forks laid beside them in a way that suggested habit rather than guesswork. He had not used those plates in years. They had been wrapped in cloth and pushed to the back of a shelf after the house went quiet, after there had been no reason to set more than one place at a time. Now they were out, catching the last of the light like they had always belonged there. He set his hat down slow, the movement more deliberate than it needed to be, and crossed to the wash basin, finding fresh water already poured, clean enough to reflect the low glow from the window. Behind him, he could hear her moving, not loudly, not in a way that claimed space, but steady, like someone who knew how to work around another person without getting in their way. The scrape of a wooden spoon against iron, the soft shift of fabric, the quiet rhythm of a place being used properly. He washed his hands, the water cool against skin still warm from the day, and when he turned back, she was setting bread on the table, cut thick and even, the knife resting where she had left it without flourish. "You did not have to do all this," he said, though the words came out less like an order and more like a fact he was still trying to settle on. She glanced up, meeting his eyes just long enough to acknowledge the statement before returning to what she was doing. "It needed doing," she said, simple as that, and there was no edge in it, no challenge, just a quiet certainty that made arguing feel unnecessary. He pulled out the chair across from her, the legs dragging soft against the floor, and sat, noticing without meaning to that she did not take her seat until he did, and even then, she waited a second longer, as if giving him time to decide whether he was staying or walking away. He stayed. The food was plain, beans cooked down with a bit of salt pork, bread still warm in the middle, and coffee poured dark enough to match the way he had always liked it, though he had never said that out loud, not to anyone who would have remembered. He took a bite, then another, the taste settling into something familiar in a way that caught him off guard. And across the table, she ate slow, not watching him directly, but aware of him the way a person is when they share a space that has not yet decided what it is meant to be. The silence between them stretched, but it was not the same as the silence that had lived in this house before. That one had been hollow, echoing in the corners, pressing in from all sides. This one held weight, like something being built one small piece at a time. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down, not because he was finished, but because something had settled in his mind that needed saying. "You know your way around a ranch kitchen," he said, eyes moving to her hands where they rested near her plate, the calluses there catching the light. She wiped her fingers on a cloth, folded it once, then twice, precise. "I know my way around work," she replied. It was not an answer, not entirely, but it was enough to tell him she was choosing what to give and what to keep. He nodded once, accepting that without pressing further, and reached for his cup, taking a slow drink. The coffee was strong, steady, made the way a person makes something when they expect it to matter. Outside, the light dipped lower, shadows stretching across the yard, and inside, the 2 plates remained on the table, not as an accident, not as a kindness, but as something quieter than both. Something that suggested the house might not be as empty as it had been that morning. Morning came in quiet, the kind that did not announce itself with sound, but with a slow change in light, gray turning to pale gold across the floorboards, and Caleb woke to it the way he always did, one eye open before the other, listening first, because listening had been enough for years. Only this time, there was something else. The faint crackle of fire already catching in the stove, the soft grind of coffee beans worked by hand, steady and unhurried, and underneath it all, the sense that the house had been awake before him. He lay still for a moment longer, staring at the ceiling beams he knew by memory, counting the seconds between each small sound, and then he swung his legs over the side of the bed, boots finding the floor without looking. The air held warmth it had not held at dawn in a long while. When he stepped into the main room, She was there, back to him, sleeves rolled, hair pinned up in a way that kept it clear of her work, and the stove glowed low and red, heat pushing out into the space like it had purpose again. She did not turn right away. She finished pouring the coffee first, then set a cup near the edge of the table, close enough for him to reach without crossing the room. "Morning," she said, simple, like it was something that belonged to both of them now. He grunted in return, not out of dismissal, but because the word felt heavier than usual in his mouth. He crossed to the table, picked up the cup, and took a sip. It was strong. The way he had always made it. He did not ask how she knew. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clean, the early light catching on the fence line in a way that showed every flaw if a man chose to see it. And Caleb stepped onto the porch after a quick swallow, expecting the usual list in his head to settle into place. South fence needed checking. Water trough near the west pasture ran low this time of year. Roof over the barn had a loose board he had meant to fix for 2 weeks now. Same work, same order. Only when he reached the edge of the porch, he paused. The gate stood closed. Properly closed, not just pushed to, but latched. He always left it resting, never fully set, a habit formed from years of coming and going without reason to worry. He frowned slightly, stepped down into the yard, and noticed the ground near the fence line, the dirt marked with fresh tracks that did not match his own. Smaller steps, steady, back and forth, like someone had walked the boundary more than once, measuring it out. He followed them without thinking, boots pressing into the prints left behind, and when he reached the south fence, he stopped again. The loose rail he had been meaning to fix had been set back into place, not perfect, not new, but reinforced with wire pulled tight and twisted clean, the kind of work that held for now and told you it would be finished properly later. Caleb reached out, tested it with his hand. It held firm. He looked along the line, eyes narrowing just enough to take in the rest. No gaps, no lean where it should not lean. He stood there a long second, the early sun warming the back of his neck, and something in his chest shifted again, small, but harder to ignore this time. Behind him, he heard the porch board creak, then her steps, measured and even, coming closer without hurry. That rail would not last another week, she said, not asking, just stating what was already true. He did not turn right away. "You walked the fence," he said. "Yes." He glanced back then, watching her where she stood a few feet away, hands resting at her sides, not proud, not apologizing. Just there. "Most folks would not know where to start," he said. She met his eyes, steady. "Most folks do not have to learn." The words settled between them, not heavy, but not light either, and Caleb looked back at the fence, then out past it, where the land stretched further than a man could see in one glance. For the first time since she had arrived, something did not sit right, not in a way that warned him, but in a way that made him pay closer attention. Because this was not guesswork. This was not luck. And whatever had brought her here, it was beginning to look like it was not as simple as a joke sent in a letter. By noon the sun had settled high and unforgiving, pressing heat down over the land until even the wind felt tired, and Caleb worked the north side of the property with a rhythm he had carried for years, steady and efficient, the kind that left little room for distraction. But today that rhythm kept slipping, just enough to notice. It showed up in small things, the way he paused longer than necessary when checking a post, the way his eyes drifted back toward the house more often than they should have, as if something there had changed the balance of everything else. He told himself it was nothing, just a pair of hands making work lighter. That was all, but it did not feel like nothing. When he returned in the late afternoon, dust settled along the cuffs of his pants and sweat dried stiff across his shirt. The yard looked different again, not in any loud or obvious way, but in the details that only showed themselves if a man knew where to look. The tools he had left scattered near the barn had been gathered, not stacked neatly like someone trying to impress, but arranged in a way that made sense, close to where they would be needed next, handles turned outward, ready to be picked up without thought. A bucket that had sat empty near the well now held water, filled fresh enough to catch the light, and the trough beside it had been topped off just enough to last through the evening. He slowed his steps as he crossed the yard, eyes narrowing slightly, not out of suspicion, but out of a kind of quiet calculation. This was not someone keeping busy to earn a place. This was someone who knew how a place ran. Inside, the air carried that same steady warmth, The stove already lit, though supper was still an hour off, and she stood at the table with a piece of paper spread flat beneath her hands, her fingers resting near the edges like she was holding it in place against a breeze that was not there. She did not hear him at first, or if she did not show it, her eyes moving across the page in a way that was not slow or searching, but practiced, as if reading was not something she did for the first time in a long while. Caleb stepped closer, boots quiet against the floor, and that was when he recognized the paper. Ranch notes, numbers, tallies he had written weeks back and left unfinished, pushed aside when the days grew too long and the work outside mattered more than the work on paper. He had never shown them to anyone. "You reading my figures?" he said, not harsh, but not light either. She looked up then, meeting his gaze without surprise, like she had expected him to ask eventually. "I am trying to understand them," she said, her voice even. "There is a difference." He moved closer, stopping at the edge of the table, eyes dropping to the page where her finger rested beside a column of numbers. "Most folks would not know what they are looking at," he said. She shifted her hand slightly, not covering the paper, not offering it either. "These are not complicated," she replied. "They are just not finished." The words settled in the space between them, quiet but certain, and Caleb felt something tighten just a fraction in his chest. Not anger, not quite, but the recognition that she was seeing more than he had intended anyone to see. He reached for the paper, lifting it just enough to glance over the figures, and there, near the margin, was a small mark that had not been there before, a correction, clean and precise, one number adjusted by a narrow amount that made the line balance in a way it had not before. He stared at it for a second longer than necessary, then set the paper back down. "You changed it," he said. "It was off," she answered. No apology, no hesitation, just the truth, given, the same way she had given everything else so far. Caleb leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, eyes moving from the numbers to her face, then back again, as if trying to place something that did not yet have a name. Outside, the light began to soften, shadows stretching long across the yard, and inside, the silence between them shifted again, not empty, not uncertain, but edged now with something new. Not suspicion, not trust either. Something in between, the kind that made a man realize he might not be the only one who understood what this place was worth. That evening settled slower than the ones before it, the light stretching thin across the horizon like it was reluctant to leave, and Caleb found himself sitting at the table earlier than usual, not because he was hungry, but because there was something about the way the day had unfolded that made the house feel different, like it was holding on to something he had not yet named. The 2 plates were already set again, same as the night before, same quiet certainty in their placement, and he noticed now that she always put his cup just slightly to the right of center, the way his hand naturally reached without thinking. He had never told her that. He sat, resting his forearms against the table, fingers loosely folded, watching the way the last of the sunlight caught in the grain of the wood, and when she moved around the stove, he did not look directly, but he was aware of every motion, the way she measured things without measuring cups, the way she checked the heat by feel instead of guesswork. "You ever been to Texas before?" he asked after a while, the question coming out like it had been waiting longer than he realized. She shook her head once as she set the pot down, steam rising soft into the dimming room. "No, sir." "Then you learned all this somewhere else." It was not a question this time. She brought the food to the table, placing his plate first, then her own, and only after everything was set did she take her seat. "I learned where I had to," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that closed the door on anything further, not harsh, not defensive, just final. In a quiet way, Caleb nodded, accepting that boundary without pushing, though his eyes lingered on her hands again, the small scars, the steady way she moved, and he took a bite of the meal without really tasting it at first, his thoughts settling somewhere between what he knew and what he did not. They ate in silence for a while, but it was not empty, not like before she arrived. This silence carried something with it, a kind of understanding that did not need to be spoken to exist. Halfway through, he noticed something else, something small but out of place enough to matter. Near the edge of the table, tucked just beneath the folded cloth, sat a second paper, not one of his, not marked by his hand or his numbers, but older, the edges worn thin, the kind of paper that had been carried a long way. He did not reach for it right away. Instead, he finished his bite, set his fork down, and then, without breaking the quiet of the room, slid the paper free with 2 fingers. She did not stop him, did not move at all. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the lines, and though the writing was not his, the language was familiar enough. Land descriptions, boundary markers, numbers that spoke of acreage and ownership, and there, near the bottom, a name written clear and steady. Eleanor Hayes. The room seemed to still around him, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of pause that comes when something shifts just enough to change how everything else fits together. He read it once, then again, slower this time, his thumb pressing lightly against the edge of the paper as if it might move if he did not hold it there. "This yours?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than before. She met his eyes across the table, not surprised, not afraid, just steady. "Yes." That was all she said. No explanation, no defense, just the truth, laid out as plainly as the plates between them. Caleb looked back down at the paper, then around the room, at the walls he had built, the table he had sanded smooth with his own hands, the land stretching out beyond the door that he had walked 1,000 times without question, and something in his chest shifted again, deeper now, not unsettling, but undeniable. He set the paper back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, and when he reached for his cup, his hand did not shake, but it did not feel as steady as it had that morning. Across from him, she continued eating, calm, unhurried, like nothing had changed at all, and maybe for her, nothing had. But for Caleb, the quiet that filled the house now was no longer just the absence of sound. It was something else entirely, something that carried the weight of a question he had not yet learned how to ask. The night stretched long after the dishes had been cleared, though neither of them said much once the paper had been folded and set aside, and Caleb sat for a while after she moved to the stove, his hands resting flat against the table as if he could steady something inside himself by holding onto the wood. He had read enough in his life to know what a deed looked like, enough to recognize boundaries drawn in careful lines and names written with purpose, but what he had not expected was to see a name that did not belong to him tied to land he had walked since he was old enough to remember. He did not ask her again that night, not because he did not want answers, but because something in the way she had said yes told him that whatever truth sat behind that paper was not something that would be pulled out by force or pressed into words before it was ready. So he let the silence take it, let it settle into the corners of the house the way everything else had, and when he finally stood, he moved slower than usual, like a man learning the shape of a place he thought he already knew. Sleep did not come easy. He lay on his back, staring up at the same beams he had counted 100 nights before, but now they did not feel as familiar, not because they had changed, but because he had. The thoughts sat there, quiet and persistent, the kind that does not shout but does not leave either. By the time morning came, pale light slipping through the window in thin lines, he was already awake, boots on, standing at the edge of the porch with a cup of coffee, cooling in his hand. The land stretched out the same as always, fence lines cutting across it, the barn leaning just enough to show its age, the dust rising soft under the first hint of wind, and yet it did not feel the same. He heard her behind him before he saw her, the door opening without a creak now that it had been worked back into use, her steps light but certain as she joined him on the porch, standing just off to his side without crowding him. Neither of them spoke at first. The morning did not need words. After a while, he set the cup down on the railing, the metal clicking soft against the wood, and looked out toward the far end of the property where the land dipped slightly before rising again toward the tree line. "How much of it?" he asked, his voice low, not demanding, just steady. She did not answer right away. He could feel her thinking, not searching for a way around the truth, but choosing how to place it. "All of it," she said finally. The words landed without force, but they carried weight all the same. Caleb let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "You knew before you came," he said. It was not a question. Yes. Another simple truth. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and ran a hand along the railing, feeling the worn grain beneath his palm. "Then why come like this?" he asked, turning his head just enough to look at her now. Really look, not at the dress or the hands or the way she moved, but at the person standing beside him. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression the same as it had been since the moment he saw her, steady, unguarded in a way that did not invite pity or offer explanation. "Because no one listens when you arrive with everything," she said. "They only listen when you arrive with nothing." The answer settled deeper than he expected, not because it surprised him, but because it made sense in a way he could not argue with. He looked back out over the land again, the fences he had fixed, the soil he had worked, the house he had filled with his own labor, and for the first time, the idea of ownership did not sit as clean as it once had. It did not make him angry. It did not make him step away. It just changed the shape of the question. Beside him, she rested her hands lightly on the railing, not claiming it, not holding it like it belonged to her, just standing there, present in the same space, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was something else now, something that held both of them in it, waiting to see what they would choose to do next. The days that followed did not break apart the way Caleb might have expected, did not turn sharp or loud or filled with questions that demanded answers, but instead settled into something quieter, something that felt almost the same on the surface and yet carried a different weight underneath. Work still began at first light, the same fence lines, the same checks along the pasture, the same slow walk of the land that had shaped his habits for years, but now there was another presence woven into it, not beside him most of the time, but ahead of him in ways he did not always see until he reached them. A gate that had been left open was already latched. A hinge that had groaned for months now moved smooth and silent. Water levels held steady without needing his hand to measure them. None of it was done to be noticed. That was the part that stayed with him. It was done because it needed doing. One afternoon, he found her near the far edge of the property where the ground dipped toward the creek, the sun hanging lower now, casting long shadows that stretched across the dry grass like quiet lines drawn by something unseen. She stood with her back to him, looking out over the bend where the water narrowed, her posture still, not resting, not idle, just present in a way that made the place feel observed rather than used. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to break that stillness too quickly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The sound of the water moving over stone carried faint and steady, mixing with the low rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. "You have been out here before," he said finally, not asking, just stating what had begun to feel more certain with each passing day. She turned her head slightly, not all the way, just enough to acknowledge him. "Yes." He stepped closer, boots pressing into the dry earth, and followed her gaze out across the land, tracing the natural lines of it, the way the fence curved with the slope instead of cutting against it, the way the trees gathered near the water where the soil held better. "You knew where the weak spots were," he added, thinking of the fence, the trough, the small things that had been handled before he reached them. She nodded once. "This land has not changed," she said. "Only the way it has been used." The words settled into him slower than the others had, not because they were harder to understand, but because they reached further back than he expected, into years he had not looked at too closely. He glanced at her then, really seeing her in the light of the late afternoon, the way the sun caught along the edge of her hair, the calm in her expression that had not wavered since the day she arrived. "You let me think it was mine," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only a quiet recognition of what had been left unsaid. She met his eyes fully now, steady as always. "You made it something worth having," she replied. "That part was yours." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, out across the stretch of land that had shaped him, that he had believed he understood completely, and for the first time, the idea that it might not belong to him did not feel like something taken, but something shared differently than he had known how to see before. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft shades that bled into each other without clear edges, and they stood there in the quiet, not as strangers, not as owner and guest, but as two people looking at the same place and beginning to understand it from the same ground up, the space between them no longer uncertain, but not yet defined either, holding something that had not been spoken and did not need to be rushed into words. It was not the land that changed first, but the people who came looking at it. The wagon arrived just past midday, wheels creaking, slow under the weight of something more than lumber, and Caleb saw it from the far side of the yard before the dust had even settled, his hand resting still against the fence post he had been checking, his eyes narrowing just enough to recognize the shape of trouble when it came riding in plain sight. Two men stepped down, coats too clean for ranch work, boots worn but not from this soil. And the way they looked around told him everything he needed to know. They were not here to admire what had been built. They were here to measure what could be taken. Eleanor was already on the porch by the time he reached the house, standing near the door with her hands resting lightly against the railing, not tense, not waiting, just present in a way that did not shift for anyone who arrived uninvited. Caleb stepped up beside her, not close enough to crowd, but close enough that the space between them felt shared without needing to be claimed. One of the men tipped his hat, not out of respect, but habit. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying that practiced smoothness that came from talking more than working. "We are looking for the owner of this property." Caleb did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, the same way he always had when a man spoke too quickly, and beside him, he felt rather than saw Eleanor remain still. "You found him," Caleb said finally, his voice even, steady as the ground beneath his boots. The man's eyes moved over him, taking in the dust, the sun-worn lines, the quiet confidence that came from years spent without needing to explain himself. "That's so," the man replied, though his tone said he had already decided otherwise. "We have paperwork that says different." He reached into his coat, pulling out a folded set of documents, edges crisp, handled carefully, and Caleb felt something shift in the air, not sharp, not sudden, but inevitable, like a storm that had been building just beyond the horizon. Before he could step forward, Eleanor moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one step, then another, until she stood at the edge of the porch, closer to the men than he was, her presence quiet but unmistakable. "You should let me see those," she said, her voice calm, not raised, not forced, but carrying in a way that made both men look at her instead of him. There was a pause, brief but telling, as if they had not expected her to speak at all, and then the second man handed the papers over without comment. She took them, her fingers steady, her eyes moving across the lines in that same practiced way Caleb had seen before, not searching, not guessing, but reading, truly reading. The yard fell quiet around them, the only sound the low shift of wind through the grass and the faint creak of the wagon behind them. Caleb watched her, not the men, not the papers, just her, the way she held them, the way her expression did not change, and for the first time since they arrived, he did not feel the need to step in front of her, did not feel the need to answer for what stood behind him. After a moment, she folded the papers back along their original lines and held them out again. "These are outdated," she said, simple as that. The first man frowned, taking the documents back, his eyes flicking down as if the truth might rearrange itself if he looked quickly enough. "That is not what we were told," he replied. Eleanor did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply reached back toward the table just inside the doorway, where the older paper still rested where Caleb had left it, and brought it forward, placing it in the man's hand with the same steady motion. "Then you were told wrong." The words did not carry force, but they did not need to. The man's eyes moved over the page, slower this time, his confidence thinning at the edges, and Caleb stood there, the sun warm against his back, the porch solid beneath his feet, watching something unfold that no longer needed him to control it. Not because he could not, but because he understood now that this was never his to defend in the way he had always believed. Beside him, Eleanor remained still, her hands now resting at her sides again, her gaze steady, and in that quiet moment, the balance of the place shifted once more, not taken, not lost, but revealed for what it had been all along. The men did not leave right away, though something in their posture had shifted, the easy certainty they had arrived with now replaced by a quieter kind of calculation, the kind that comes when a man realizes he may have stepped onto ground that does not belong to him. The first one folded the papers slower this time, eyes lingering on the name, on the lines that traced the land in a way that could not be argued with, and for a moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the yard, lifting dust just enough to catch the light, and somewhere near the barn, a loose board tapped soft against the frame, the sound steady, almost rhythmic. "Well," the man said finally, clearing his throat like he needed to reset his voice, "seems there has been some misunderstanding." Eleanor did not respond. She did not nod or soften the moment with politeness. She simply stood there, the same as she had since the wagon arrived, her presence unchanged by their hesitation. Caleb felt it then, not in his hands or his stance, but in the space itself, the way the porch held all of them without shifting, the way the house behind him no longer felt like something he had to guard. The second man glanced toward him, as if remembering that he was there, as if unsure now where he fit into the arrangement they had assumed when they first stepped down from the wagon. "You have been working this land," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Caleb met his gaze, steady, without offering more than what was asked. "Yes." The man nodded slowly, eyes moving back to Eleanor, then to the house, then out across the stretch of pasture that rolled out beyond the fence line. "You have kept it well," he added, and there was something different in his tone now, not respect exactly, but recognition of effort that could not be dismissed. Caleb did not answer that. He did not need to. Eleanor spoke instead. "He has," she said, her voice even, not loud, but carrying clearly enough that both men heard it without question. The words settled between them. Simple, but they carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. Caleb glanced at her then, just briefly, and something in his chest eased in a way he had not expected, not because of the approval, but because of the way she gave it, without hesitation, without taking anything from him in the process. The first man shifted his weight, folding the papers back into his coat, his eyes no longer sharp, but thoughtful in a way that suggested he was already deciding how to explain this visit when he returned to wherever he had come from. "We will need to correct our records," he said, more to himself than to them, though the words hung in the air all the same. "Make sure everything reflects what is written here." Eleanor inclined her head slightly, not as agreement, not as dismissal, just acknowledgement. "You should," she said. The conversation could have ended there. It might have, on any other day, in any other place, where land was only land and names on paper were the only truth that mattered. But something held the moment a little longer. The second man stepped forward just a fraction, his eyes moving between the two of them, then settling on Eleanor. "And you intend to remain here," he said. She did not look at Caleb when she answered. "Yes." No explanation, no elaboration, just the same quiet certainty she had carried since the day she arrived. The man nodded once, as if that answered more than he had asked, and then he stepped back, turning toward the wagon without another word. The first man followed, slower, casting one last look at the house, at the yard, at Caleb standing where he had always stood, and at Eleanor beside him, not behind, not ahead, just there. Then they climbed back onto the wagon, the wheels groaning as they turned, pulling away from the yard the same way they had come, only now without the same confidence in their path. Caleb watched them go until the dust settled back into the ground, until the sound of the wheels faded into nothing, and the yard returned to its usual stillness. Beside him, Eleanor did not move. Neither did he. The porch held them both, the house behind, the land stretching out in front, and for the first time, the question was no longer who owned it. It was what they would do with it now that the truth had been spoken aloud. The dust had long settled by the time Caleb stepped down from the porch, but the quiet that followed did not feel like the kind he had known. Before, it was not empty, not something that pressed in from all sides, but something that waited, like the land itself was holding its breath to see what would come next. He walked a few paces into the yard, then stopped, his boots resting in the same ground he had crossed 1,000 times, and for the first time, he did not move with the same certainty. Not because he did not know the land, but because he understood now that knowing it and owning it were not the same thing. Behind him, the door creaked soft as Eleanor stepped out again, her presence steady, unchanged by what had just happened, and she came to stand beside him without a word, the same way she had that morning, the same way she had since the moment she arrived. Neither of them spoke at first. The wind moved slow across the pasture, bending the dry grass in a single direction, and somewhere near the barn, a horse shifted its weight, the sound faint but grounding. Caleb ran a hand along the back of his neck, then let it fall, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "You could have said something sooner," he said finally, not accusing, just laying the thought out where it could be seen. Eleanor did not look at him right away. She watched the land instead, the same stretch he had been studying, her eyes tracing the lines of it with a familiarity that no longer surprised him. "Would it have changed anything?" she asked. He considered that, turning the question over in his mind the way he would a piece of equipment, checking it from all sides before deciding if it held. After a moment, he shook his head once, slow. "No," he admitted. I would have worked it the same. She nodded slightly, as if that was the answer she had expected all along. That is why I did not, she said. The words settled between them, not heavy, not light, just true. Caleb exhaled, the breath leaving him slower than usual, and he shifted his weight, turning just enough to face her now, not fully, but more than before. So what now, he asked. It was not a challenge. It was not a demand. It was a question asked by a man who understood that the answer no longer belonged to him alone. Eleanor finally turned her head, meeting his eyes with that same steady gaze, the one that did not waver, did not soften unless it chose to. Now we decide what to keep, she said. He frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought. Keep, he repeated. She gestured lightly toward the house, the barn, the fences stretching out across the land. The work, she said. The way it runs. The parts that matter. Caleb followed her gesture, his eyes moving over each piece in turn, seeing it not just as something he had built, but as something that had been built into the land itself, shaped by time and effort and choices made day after day without thinking they would ever be questioned. And the rest? He asked. She held his gaze a second longer before answering. We let it go if it does not belong. The words were quiet, but they carried a kind of clarity that cut through everything else, and Caleb felt it settle into him, not as something taken, but as something offered, a way forward that did not erase what he had done, but did not claim more than it should either. He nodded once, slow and certain, and turned back toward the house, taking a few steps before pausing again, glancing over his shoulder at her. She had not moved, still standing there, hands resting lightly at her sides, looking out over the land like she had all the time in the world to decide what it would become. Supper will be ready soon, she said, not as a command, not as a question, just a simple fact placed into the space between them. Caleb gave a small nod, then continued toward the house, the boards of the porch solid under his feet, the door open in a way it had not been for years, and inside, the table would be set the same as it had been the night before. 2 plates, not because one owned the place and the other did not, but because both had chosen to remain. That night the house felt settled in a way Caleb had not known before, not because anything grand had changed, but because the small things had found their place without being forced there, and he noticed it in the way the fire held steady without needing to be tended every few minutes, in the way the air carried the faint smell of bread and coffee even after supper had ended, in the way the table remained with 2 plates for longer than necessary, as if neither of them was in a hurry to clear it back to what it had been before. He sat there for a while after they finished eating, his hands resting loosely near his cup, turning it slowly between his fingers, watching the last of the lamplight flicker against the surface of the liquid. Across from him, Eleanor gathered the dishes without rush, her movements quiet, practiced, the kind that did not interrupt the space but moved within it, and when she passed behind him, he felt it again, that steady presence, not pressing, not asking, just there. You ever think about leaving it? He asked after a while, his voice low, not directed at her entirely, more like something he had been carrying and finally set down. She paused at the basin, water running soft as she rinsed the plates, the sound filling the space between them before her answer came. No, she said. He nodded, though she could not see it from where she stood, his eyes fixed on the grain of the table, tracing lines that had been worn smooth by time. Even before, he added, meaning before she arrived, before the paper, before the question of who the land belonged to had changed shape. She dried her hands on a cloth, folded it once, then turned, leaning lightly against the edge of the counter, her gaze steady as always. Especially before, she replied. The answer settled deeper than he expected, and he let out a quiet breath, leaning back slightly in his chair. Most people would have sold it, he said, taken what it was worth and moved on. She did not argue that. She did not dismiss it either. Most people do not know what something is worth until they leave it, she said. Caleb glanced up at her then, studying her face in the soft light, the calm there, the certainty that did not need to prove itself. And you do? He asked. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked toward the door, toward the darkness beyond it where the land lay quiet under the night sky. I know what it becomes if no one stays, she said. The words were simple, but they carried something he recognized, not from her, but from himself, from the years he had spent here without thinking about why he stayed, only knowing that leaving had never been an option that felt right. He nodded once, slow, then pushed his chair back and stood, the movement deliberate, as if marking the end of something he had not realized he was holding on to. He stepped to the door, opening it just enough to let the night air slip in, cool against the warmth of the house, and he stood there for a moment, looking out over the land that no longer felt like something he had to claim, but something he had been part of all along. Behind him, he heard her move again, the quiet rhythm of the house continuing, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was standing alone in it. "We will need to fix the west fence tomorrow," he said after a while, not turning, just speaking into the space they now shared. There was a small pause, then her voice, steady as ever. "Yes." No hesitation, no question, just agreement, like it had already been decided. Caleb nodded once, though she could not see it, and stepped back inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click, the sound settling into the house like something that belonged there, like something that would be there again the next night, and the one after that, not because it had to be, but because they had both chosen to stay. Morning came cooler than the day before, a thin layer of cloud stretching across the sky that softened the light and made the land feel quieter, like it had settled into something steady overnight. And Caleb was already out by the west fence when Eleanor joined him, her steps measured across the dry ground, the sound of her boots blending into the low rustle of grass moving with the wind. He did not turn when she approached. He did not need to. "Post is loose near the corner," he said, nodding toward the far end where the fence dipped slightly, the line no longer holding straight the way it should. "I saw it," she replied, stepping past him without pause, moving toward the spot with a familiarity that no longer surprised him, only confirmed what he had already begun to understand. They worked without speaking at first, the rhythm of it falling into place naturally. He held the post steady while she set the wire, her hands firm, precise, twisting it tight with a motion that wasted nothing, and when he tested it, it held the way it should, not temporary, not careless, but done right. The kind of work that stayed. He stepped back, wiping his hands against his pants, and watched her for a moment longer than necessary. The way she moved, the way she checked the line again without being told, and something settled in him, quiet but certain, like a decision that had been forming for days and had finally found its shape. "You are not leaving," he said, not asking, not even turning it into a question, just placing it there between them as something already understood. She straightened, brushing her hands lightly together, then looked at him, her expression the same as it had always been, steady, without hesitation. "No," she said. He nodded once, slow, and turned his gaze back to the fence, to the land stretching beyond it, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of water from the creek, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled slow against the muted sky. "Then we do this right," he said after a while, his voice low, but carrying the weight of something more than just the task in front of them. She did not ask what he meant. She did not need to. "Yes," she replied. The words settled into place as easily as everything else between them had begun to, not forced, not negotiated, just agreed. Caleb walked the line a few steps, then stopped again, glancing back at her, not with uncertainty, but with a kind of quiet resolve that had not been there before. "Not because it is mine," he added, the words slower now, more deliberate. "Because it is worth keeping." She held his gaze for a moment, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression, not a change, not a shift away from what she had been, but a small opening, something that acknowledged what he had said without needing to speak it back. "That is enough," she said. They returned to the work then, moving along the fence together, not side by side every moment, not needing to match each step, but working within the same space, the same purpose, and as the day moved on, the line straightened, the weak points reinforced, the structure holding firmer with each adjustment. By the time the sun broke through the clouds and cast light back across the land, the fence stood as it should, not new, not perfect, but solid, and Caleb stood there a moment, looking at it, then at the house in the distance, then at Eleanor, who had already begun gathering the tools without waiting for instruction. He picked up the last coil of wire, resting it over his shoulder, and started back toward the house, his steps steady, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had, and for the first time, the direction felt clear, not owned, not claimed, but chosen. The kind of choice a man makes when he knows he is not staying out of habit anymore, but because he has decided to. Some folks believe a place becomes a home the moment your name is written on it. But that is not how it works. Not really. Because a name can sit on paper for years without ever touching the ground it claims. And a house can stand full of walls and still feel empty until someone chooses to stay inside it. The days moved forward the way they always had on the Turner land. Sun rising over the same line of trees. Wind cutting across the same stretch of open pasture. Work waiting in the same quiet way it always did. But something had settled into those days now. Something steady and unspoken that did not need to be explained to exist. Caleb found himself moving through the work with a different kind of awareness, not watching for what might fail, not measuring what still needed fixing, but noticing what held, what had already been made strong by hands that understood more than they said. Eleanor worked beside that rhythm without interrupting it, not trying to lead, not stepping back, simply present in every part that mattered. And over time, the line between what had been his and what had been hers faded into something that no longer needed to be separated. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the sky in soft colors that bled into each other without sharp edges, Caleb stepped onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee, setting one near the railing where she stood looking out over the land. She took it without turning right away, her fingers brushing the tin just long enough to feel the warmth before she brought it closer, and they stood there in that quiet again, the kind that no longer asked anything of them. The fences held. The barn stood. The house behind them carried light in its windows as the evening deepened, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been placed where it belonged. You could change it, Caleb said after a while, his voice low, not breaking the quiet, just moving within it. Sell it. Build something else somewhere new. Eleanor shook her head slightly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. I did not come here to change it, she said. I came to see if it was worth keeping. Caleb nodded once, the answer settling into him without resistance, and he looked out across the land again, not as something he had to hold on to, not as something he might lose, but as something that had been given meaning by the work, by the time, by the choice to remain when leaving would have been easier. And is it? He asked. She finally turned then, meeting his eyes with that same steady look that had never wavered since the day she arrived. But now there was something else in it, something warmer, something that did not need to be hidden or held back. Yes, she said. The word was simple, but it carried everything with it. Caleb let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes he does not need to ask the question again, and he rested his hand lightly against the railing, the worn wood familiar beneath his palm. Inside, the table waited, 2 plates set without thought, without question, not as a habit, but as something chosen each day without needing to be said aloud. The night settled in slow, the first stars appearing above the dark line of trees, and the house held its warmth against the cooling air, not empty, not quiet in the way it had once been, but full in a way that could not be measured by land or paper or names written in ink. And if you stood there long enough, watching the light fade and the dark take its place, you might come to understand that what they had built was not something that could be owned at all, but something far simpler and far more lasting. A place where 2 people had chosen, day after day, to stay, and in that choice, found something that looked a lot like home.